After my divorce, I made a promise to myself that I was never going to end up in the same relationship again. I was going to heal. I was going to learn from everything that had happened to me. I was going to do the work. And if I'm honest, I felt pretty confident about it because I had awareness now. I could see things I couldn't see before. I could recognize red flags. I understood relationship dynamics better than ever. I understood myself better. I understood what I wanted and what I didn't want. At least I thought I did, anyways. Then something happened that completely caught me off guard. I started noticing familiar feelings showing up again. Not necessarily with the same person, not necessarily in the same circumstances, but the emotional experience felt strangely familiar. The overthinking, the waiting, the wondering, the analyzing, the second guessing, the feeling that somehow my emotional well being was tied to another person's behavior. And I remember thinking, is this possible? I know better now. I've lived through this already. I've spent years healing. I've spent years working on myself. Why does this still feel familiar? That question frustrated me for a really long time because I think many of us assume that awareness automatically creates change. We assume that once we understand the pattern, we'll naturally stop repeating it. But that wasn't my experience. In fact, some of the most frustrating moments came after I became aware, because now I could see the pattern. And yet, I still found myself feeling pulled toward it. For a long time, I thought repeating a relationship meant finding the same person over and over again, the same personality, the same behaviors, and the same problems. Because of that, I spent a lot of time looking outward. I was looking for red flags, looking for warning signs, looking for the things I needed to avoid. And don't get me wrong, I think that's important too. I think there are absolutely things we should pay attention to. But eventually I realized something. I was becoming really good at spotting red flags, practically an expert. Yet I was still ending up in the same emotional experience. That was so confusing because if the problem was simply choosing the wrong people, then awareness should have fixed it. Awareness should have changed everything, but it didn't. And I think that's where a lot of women get stuck because they know better. They've read the books, they've listened to the podcasts, they've gone to therapy, they've spent years trying to understand themselves. Yet somehow, they still find themselves asking the same questions. Why do I keep ending up in the exact same place? Why does this keep happening? Why does every relationship eventually start feeling the same? And I think the answer is much deeper than most people realize. Because patterns don't start when the relationship begins. Patterns start long before that. Patterns shape what feels familiar. Patterns shape what feels attractive. Patterns shape what we overlook. They shape what we tolerate. Patterns shape what we fight for. And most of the time, we're completely unaware they're doing it. Think about it. Two people can walk into the exact same relationship and have completely different experiences. One person sees a warning sign and leaves, and another person sees the same warning sign and stays. Why? It's usually not because one person is smarter. It's usually not because one person has more information. It's because they're operating from different beliefs, different emotional conditioning, different experiences, different patterns. That's when I started asking a different question. Instead of asking, why do I keep choosing the wrong people? I started asking, what is it about this dynamic that feels familiar to me? That question changed everything. Because the answer wasn't what I expected. The answer wasn't about them. The answer was about me. Not in a blame yourself kind of way. Not in a shame myself kind of way. In an awareness kind of way. Because once I stopped focusing exclusively on the other person, I started seeing their role my own patterns were playing. I started seeing how often I confused familiarity with compatibility, how often I confused chemistry with emotional conditioning, how often I confused hope with reality. And that's when I realized something that completely changed the way I viewed relationships. Maybe I was repeating people, maybe I was repeating patterns. So, what exactly is a pattern? Because I think this is where a lot of people get confused. When most people hear the word pattern, they immediately think about behavior. They think, I keep choosing the same type of person. I keep ending up in the toxic relationship. I keep ignoring red flags. And while those things can absolutely be part of the pattern, they usually are not the pattern itself. They're symptoms of the pattern. The pattern lives deeper than that. The pattern is the emotional experience that keeps repeating itself. For me, it wasn't necessarily the same person, it was the same feelings, the same anxiety, the same uncertainty, the same overthinking, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the same fear of losing the relationship, the same feeling that somehow I needed to earn love instead of simply receiving it. Different people, same emotional experience. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it because suddenly I realized I wasn't repeating circumstances, I was repeating a familiar emotional environment. And that's important because most people spend all of their time trying to change the circumstances. They change the person, they change the relationship, they change the environment, but they never stop to examine the emotional blueprint they're carrying into those experiences. Imagine moving into a new house. The furniture is different, the neighborhood is different, the paint color is different, everything looks different, but you bring the exact same blueprint with you and build the exact same house. At some point, you have to stop looking at the house and start looking at the blueprint. That's what I eventually realized. The relationship wasn't the blueprint, the pattern was. And patterns are powerful because they create familiarity, not happiness, not health, familiarity. And human beings are naturally drawn toward what feels familiar, even when what's familiar hurts. That's why someone can spend years in a painful relationship, finally leave, and still feel pulled toward the same dynamic later. That's not because they want to suffer. It's not because they're broken. It's because their nervous system recognizes the pattern. It knows the rules. It knows how to survive there. It knows what to expect there. The uncertainty is familiar. The inconsistency is familiar. The emotional highs and lows are familiar. The waiting is familiar. The hoping is familiar. The earning is familiar. And that's where awareness alone starts to run into a problem because awareness happens in the mind. Patterns live much deeper. You can understand a pattern intellectually and still feel emotionally drawn to it. You can recognize that a relationship isn't healthy and still miss it. You can know better and still feel pulled back toward what's familiar. I think that's one of the most frustrating parts of healing because people assume that once they understand the problem should disappear. But that's not how patterns work. Patterns aren't changed by awareness alone. Patterns change when new experiences begin challenging the old blueprint. Patterns change when you stop responding the way you have always responded. Patterns change when you stop abandoning yourself, when you stop choosing familiarity over truth. And the process takes a lot more than awareness. It takes practice, it takes self trust, it takes consistency, it takes learning how to tolerate something that initially feels unfamiliar. Because if you've spent years operating inside one emotional blueprint, a healthier blueprint isn't going to feel natural right away. In fact, sometimes it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels boring. It feels wrong. Not because it is wrong, because it's unfamiliar. And that's where real change begins. And I think this is the part that catches most people off guard. Because once you become aware of the pattern, you assume you'll naturally be drawn to something healthier. I know I did. I thought once I understood what wasn't working, healthy relationships would feel obvious, easy, natural, like a breath of fresh air. Instead, sometimes they felt uncomfortable. And that was incredibly confusing because for years I had told myself I wanted peace. I wanted consistency. I wanted honesty. emotional safety, someone I didn't have to chase. I wanted someone I didn't have to figure out. I wanted someone who showed up consistently. But when those qualities actually showed up, part of me didn't know what to do with them because there was no mystery, no emotional roller coaster, no wondering where I stood, no constant need to analyze every interaction, no highs and lows, no chasing, no earning, no proving. And if you've spent years operating inside those dynamics, the absence of them can feel strange. Not because something is wrong, because something is different. For years, my nervous system had learned how to operate in uncertainty. It knew how to wait, how to hope, how to overthink, how to work harder when something felt unstable. It knew how to earn. What it didn't know how to do was simply receive. Receive consistency, kindness, honesty, effort, receive love that wasn't attached to performance. And that's when I realized something. A lot of people say they want healthy love, but healthy love requires a completely different skill set than survival. Survival teaches you how to adapt. Healthy love teaches you how to trust. Survival teaches you how to earn. Healthy love teaches you how to receive. Survival teaches you how to stay hypervigilant. Healthy love teaches you how to relax. And for someone who's spent years surviving, those things can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, because they're unfamiliar. That's why so many people leave one painful relationship and end up right back in another version of the same emotional experience. Not because they're consciously choosing pain, because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when the familiar is hurting them. That's a hard truth because most of us want to believe we'll naturally choose what's healthy, but often we choose what feels familiar first. And that's exactly why changing a pattern requires more than awareness. It requires learning how to stay present when something healthier feels unfamiliar. It requires learning how to tolerate peace, how to tolerate consistency, not having to earn your place in someone's life. And if I'm honest, that was one of the hardest parts of my own healing, to recognize healthy patterns, learning how to stop repeating unhealthy patterns. Because once you stop chasing chaos, you're left with something many people have never learned how to do. Trust yourself. Trust the relationship. Trust that you don't have to perform to be loved. Trust that your worth isn't tied to what you provide. Trust that being chosen isn't something you learn. And that kind of trust doesn't happen overnight. It's built. One decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one act of self respect at a time, one moment of choosing reality over familiarity at a time. That's how the pattern finally starts to lose its grip. So, if awareness isn't enough, what actually begins to change the pattern? For me, the answer was much simpler than I expected, but it was also much harder because changing the pattern didn't start with changing other people. It started with changing my relationship with myself. And I know that sounds cliche, but hear me out. For years, I thought the solution was finding the right person, finding the healthier relationship, finding the relationship that would finally make me feel secure. But eventually, I realized something. No relationship was ever going to create something inside of me that I wasn't willing to build myself. Because every time I looked back at the relationships that hurt me the most, I noticed something. There were moments when I knew, moments when something felt off, moments when my intuition was trying to get my attention, moments when I felt uneasy, moments when I knew I was accepting less than I needed, moments when I knew I was abandoning myself. The problem wasn't that those moments didn't exist. The problem was that I didn't trust them. I trusted potential over more than reality. I trusted hope more than truth. I trusted someone else's promises more than my own experience. And every time I did that, I taught myself something dangerous. I taught myself that my own voice couldn't be trusted. That realization changed everything because suddenly healing wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about rebuilding trust with the person I'd spent years second guessing, myself. And self-trust isn't built through massive breakthroughs. It's built through small decisions. It's built when you stop explaining away what you know. It's built when you stop talking yourself out of your feelings. It's built when your intuition says, pay attention, hello. And for once, you actually listen. It's built when you set a boundary and keep it. It's built when you stop making excuses for behavior that consistently hurts you. It's built when you stop sacrificing your own needs in order to keep someone else comfortable. Those moments seem small, but they're not. Because every one of those decisions sends a message to yourself, a message that says, I matter. My needs matter. My feelings matter. My intuition matters. And over time, those small decisions start creating something powerful. They start creating evidence. Evidence that you can trust yourself. Evidence that you can protect yourself. Evidence that you can survive disappointment without abandoning yourself. And once that begins happening, something interesting starts to shift. The things that used to attract you don't feel quite as attractive anymore. The things you used to tolerate become harder to tolerate. The things you used to justify become harder to justify. Not because you're forcing yourself to change, because you're becoming someone who trusts herself enough to choose differently. That's when the pattern begins to break. Not when you find the perfect relationship, not when you've healed every wound, not when you've figured everything out. The pattern begins to break the moment you stop abandoning yourself to maintain it. And the moment you practice that, the less power the pattern has, because patterns survive through repetition. But they begin to die the moment you stop participating in them. And maybe that's the real reason so many people feel frustrated with their healing journey, because they aren't repeating the same relationship, they're repeating the same pattern. And those are two very different things. One has you focused on other people, the other has you focused on yourself. For years, I thought my biggest problem was who I was choosing. And while that played a role, it wasn't the whole story. The bigger issue was the emotional blueprint I was carrying into those relationships. The beliefs I carried, the fears, the habits, the ways I abandoned myself, the ways I ignored myself, the ways I stopped trusting myself. Because no matter where I went, I took those things with me. And that's why changing the pattern became so much more important than changing the person. Because if the pattern stays the same, eventually the experience starts to feel the same. Maybe the face changes, the circumstance change, maybe the details change, but the emotional experience remains familiar. And that's exhausting. It's exhausting to feel like you're doing the work and still finding yourself in the same place. It's exhausting to understand the pattern and still feel pulled towards it. It's exhausting to know better and wonder why knowing better hasn't changed everything. But maybe that's because awareness is never supposed to be the finish line. Maybe awareness is simply just the beginning of asking better questions, the beginning of noticing things you couldn't see before, the beginning of recognizing the beliefs and patterns that have quietly shaped your relationships for years. Because once you can see them, you finally have a choice. Not a perfect choice, not an easy choice, but a choice. A choice to stop abandoning yourself, a choice to stop explaining away what you know, a choice to stop choosing familiarity over truth, a choice to stop measuring your worth through someone else's ability to see it, a choice to start trusting yourself, and that is where real change begins. Not when someone else changes, not when the perfect relationship arrives, not when your fears disappear, but when you begin showing up differently for yourself. When you stop participating in the pattern that's been running your life. Because the moment you stop participating in it, the pattern begins to lose its power. And if you're watching this and realizing that maybe you've spent years understanding the pattern, but still repeating it, that's exactly why I created Mini Reclaim. It's designed to help you identify the beliefs, patterns, and survival strategies that keep pulling you back into the same experiences. You'll find the link below. Start here. Because awareness is important, but awareness without action rarely creates change. And changing the pattern starts with taking the next step. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, how do I know if I'm repeating a pattern? And I think that's such an important question because patterns rarely announce themselves. They don't show up wearing a name tag. They don't walk into your life and say, hey, I'm the lesson you haven't learned yet. Most of the time, they feel completely justified, completely reasonable, completely familiar. In fact, you're in the middle of a pattern right now. There's a good chance you don't feel like it's a pattern at all. That probably feels like hope, like love, like trying. It probably feels like being patient. It probably feels like giving someone another chance. That's why patterns can be so difficult to see while you're inside of them. Because patterns don't disguise themselves as problems, they disguise themselves as solutions. I know mine did. I thought I was being understanding, and I thought I was being compassionate. I thought I was giving people grace. I thought I was fighting for my relationship. And sometimes I was. But other times I was simply repeating a familiar role: the fixer, the caretaker, the overgiver, the one who carried the emotional weight, the one who waited, the one who hoped, the one who stayed, the one who kept trying. And here's what I've noticed: when we're repeating a pattern, we often spend more time managing the relationship than experiencing it. Think about that for a second. Managing it, trying to keep it alive, trying to keep it together, trying to keep the peace, trying to keep someone interested, trying to keep someone happy, trying to keep things from falling apart. That's very different from experiencing a healthy relationship. Healthy relationships don't require constant management. They require participation, mutual effort, mutual accountability, mutual investment. And if you're constantly exhausted by the relationship, constantly analyzing it and trying to make it work, that's worth paying attention to. Not because the relationship is doomed, but because exhaustion is often a clue that you're carrying more than your share, a clue that you're abandoning yourself somewhere in the process, a clue that the pattern may be running the show. And here's another clue: pay attention to the stories you keep telling yourself. He just needs more time. Things will get better. If I can just explain it differently, if I can just be more patient, if I can just love them enough. I've told myself every one of those stories, and maybe some of them are true, but maybe they're not. That's why awareness matters. Not so you can judge yourself, not so you can shame yourself, so you can get curious, so you can pause, and so you can ask yourself a different question. Instead of asking, how do I make this relationship work? Ask yourself, what is this relationship teaching me about myself? Because that question will tell you far more about the pattern than the relationship ever will. And sometimes the answer isn't what we want to hear. Sometimes the answer is what we've been abandoning ourselves. Sometimes the answer is that we've confused hope with reality. Sometimes the answer is that we've been trying to earn something that should never have been needed to be earned. But once we can see that, everything starts to change. Because you can't change a pattern you can't see. But once you see it, you finally have a choice.